We're going to start by creating a new infinite terrain that will render pretty quickly and be used as a replacement for our ground plane that has just a little more elevation variation. So it's not just completely flat. So what we want to do in order to create our own infinite terrain is first start out with just a regular procedural terrain, and we can edit the object, turn off the zero edges mode so that we can see the entire fractal. Zero edges mode will not work with the infinite terrain. And if it did, it would smooth it out way too much and really would be too flat. Now what I want to do is right-click on the function within the procedural tab, reset it, and we're going to start with just a new function. Switch over to our world mapping mode and select no. We don't want to add any additional functions to it to keep the scale the same. We don't need to. We just want something really basic. The simpler the function, the faster it's going to render. And what I want to do is add a fractal node and connect our altitude to the altitude of that fractal. And we have a Perlin noise gradient by default. So under Perlin noises, you can select gradient. A terrain Perlin noise, it can also render very quickly if you switch it to the value simple noise. And then what we want to do is reduce the gain output because we don't want to have any really big cutoffs. And we're going to increase the metascale and the largest feature amount. We'll probably bring that metascale up to 2 kilometers. And then set our largest feature to 300 meters. Reduce our gain. And then let's go ahead and turn on with rotation, add a little more variation to it. Click OK. And this is going to be a pretty high elevation to start with. So all we really need to do is just reduce the scale. Going over to the numerics tab, the middle button is the size, and we're going to set that to, let's say, 30 meters. Just to start with, it might be a little too high still. It looks like it is, but let's go ahead and convert it. What we're going to do is edit the object, and in the upper left there's the terrain options. We can convert that to an infinite terrain, so just by checking infinite terrain. And it's going to ask if we want to delete our ground plane. Click yes. Now once this is an infinite terrain, it can no longer be switched back to a regular procedural terrain. What we would have to do is convert this manually by making a new procedural terrain set to a world mapping mode. You can copy the function and paste it into another terrain if you needed to convert it back. So let's go ahead and change this Z to 10 meters. And now we have what should render pretty quickly. I'm going to go over to our position. So that's the top here in the numerics, the Z position, set it to 0. So now we have something that should render pretty quickly. And now we can see that variation a lot better than just a ground plane. If we want to speed it up a little bit more, we can edit the function of the terrain. The terrain Perlin noise does take longer to render than the regular Perlin noise. So you could just bring that over to the Perlin noise gradient if you didn't want as much roughness as this one has. What I'm going to do is change the roughness setting to 0.3, select the altitude link from the fractal to the altitude, add a filter, and set it to the opposite mode. That's going to invert the look of it. And if we zoom in really far, this way we have more of mounds rather than the ridges. That can also be set within the fractal itself. If we select the simple fractal, click edit, you can go between the billows and ridge modes, but I'm just going to invert the ridges That'll look pretty good. And maybe we can bring our scale up to 20 and take a look. And if you don't like the seams that are showing, because the terrain for Illinois, because of the way it is set up, can show some seams, especially if we have the ridge mode inverted. Go ahead and switch that over to Illinois gradient, and we can take a look at a much more simplified node, bring it to 30 meters on the height, which isn't actually 30 meters high. That is the extent of the terrain. The terrain itself and the elevation is only a small portion of that. With an infinite terrain, it's more difficult to really tell the exact height unless you look at it within the side viewport or the front viewport. Just because it does vary so much throughout the scene. But now we have something that's a little bit better. It renders quicker, and it'll work well as a ground plane replacement for something that's relatively flat, but does have a little bit of variation to it. So if we want to add a material to this, what we can do is load in a material, and I'm going to go to, we can select from the view materials, and then we can customize it. Let's start with, under landscapes, grass. I'm just going to add a nice grass to everything. And then I'm going to go into the material, add a layer, and go over to material layers. And most of the material layers have a built-in alpha. We're going to use the grass layer. Edit the function for the color. And because this is a brightness or a color correction color node, if this is selected and we select the link between color and brightness, add a color map node, it's going to create another brightness one. We're going to change that to the HLS shift and modify the hue. Let's do -0.1, make it more brown. A little bit too much there, so -0.01, just to make it a little bit more yellow. We'll change the saturation to 0.01, just add a tiny bit more saturation. And then we'll go ahead and click the randomize button. And if the alpha is set too high, right now the alpha boosted is at 100%, so it might show too much in the material. If we set it to 0, it's going to show exactly what we get from the alpha production. And then the environment tab already has a preset set up for the altitude range. Whenever you have a multiple or a layered material, the environment tab becomes available. So when you save out the material as a layer, this information is stored and remembered. We're going to go ahead and just keep the defaults for that. And we've got a nice variable grass with a nice little infinite terrain, a little more variation to it. And what we can do now, if we want to save this out, we can edit the object and go to Save in the lower right of the terrain editor. Also, the zone mode may not be showing the entire terrain properly, depending on the scale and the position of the scene, but that doesn't really matter unless you're going to be going in and painting. In that case, what you can do is delete the entire terrain and click Entire or close it out, and it'll automatically create a new entire terrain zone. But what I'm going to do is click Save, and now we can save out what is a PRT file, which is a procedural terrain file. This is an infinite terrain. I'll just save this into my infinite terrain directory as part of my installation, and we'll just call this flat grass. Click Save, and then it's going to give us a preview. Click OK. OK again. So now whenever we want to load this in, we can right mouse click on that procedural terrain button, and then we'll see that flat grass is now in there. So easy way to create infinite terrains You can really take any terrain, just convert it to infinite, and then save it out if you want it available as an infinite terrain. But just remembering that once it is infinite, it cannot be converted back. That is a manual process where you have to copy the function over to another procedural terrain in order to get it to show. So this doesn't render as quickly, of course, as a ground plane because of all the extra geometry that needs to be added in. The higher you are off the ground, of course, the longer it's going to take to render because it's more information that needs to be processed to the distance and out to the horizon. I do have relighting on right now so we can see the changes in the elevation a little bit better. What I want to show now is a way we can customize lighting throughout the scene using light gels on the sunlight, which is a pretty cool way to add variable light outside of just using clouds to create shadows. These, of course, will work together with clouds. It'll create a variable lighting throughout the entire scene. So what we want to do, and I'm just going to change my focal length a little bit, see a little bit more of the scene. Right now we just have a regular sunlight. There's no variable lighting at all. If we go to this second button within the aspect tab, what we can do is right click and edit gel. And once we do that, it's going to ask to load in a gel. I'm just going to click the X. Actually, there's a better way. If we right click on the bottom button, go to edit lighting, we can go to the gel, enable light gel. And by default, with a infinite light or a sunlight, it's going to create a spherical gel. So now we can edit the material. And we don't need to do much for the color, unless you want to have a variable color, which is possible. What I want to do is right-click, load a color map, and under rocks and grass, there's a black and white right at the top. Click OK. And now what we can do is set up a variable lighting based on that. White's going to be the normal brightness of the light. Black is going to be no brightness. So what we can do is add just a fractal. And Perlin noise gradient's the default. We'll turn on with rotation. I'm going to add metascale to add a variation and add a little bit of the largest feature amount. Increase roughness to, say, 0.85. And I'm going to leave it like that for now just so you can see a very large change. And we can already see in the preview a very, very dark area showing up that looks almost like there would be clouds in there creating those shadows. But this is just a subtraction of the light from that light gel. When the gain is set as high as it is, we have this really darkened area where we're going to have only ambient lighting. So if we want to improve the look of that and just have a basic variation, we can go to edit the gel, right-click, edit material, edit the function, and take the gain and bring it down really far, say 0.1. Click OK. And now we're going to get a very distributed function and that fractal. What looks like a variation in what would be like a cloud layer or a thickness change in the atmosphere. So whether or not you have clouds in the scene or not, or if you just want to improve on the shadows from the clouds, because sometimes the clouds can have a very sharp edge. If you want to soften them up a bit, this is a good way to kind of add to any cloud shadows and kind of mix them together. And you see if we do the relighting, we can see the light showing up with the variation and that light gel. So you can create complex light gels or simplified light gels. You can really do a lot with it. You can also change the color. So if we wanted to have, right now we just have black and white, so it's going to use the typical sun settings in order to modify the lighting. But if we were to load in, let's go to colorful and select the rainbow. it's going to use that gradient and create variable light from that based on the color. So there's really no dark areas except what's dark within the color itself, and now it creates a variable lighting that way based on color and not just the brightness. So it's pretty neat what we can do with it. It does look like there's a little bit of a problem within that fractal, and it might be because of the rotation. If we edit the function, turn off that with rotation, it might work a little bit better. Also, there is an alpha for the look of this, which would work more as the direct brightness, which areas have a gel or are using the gel and which ones aren't. Right now it's connected to the color map, which really doesn't have any information in it because that is connected to the opacity filter within the color map. You can add key points and change opacity values just like you can with color. So what we would want to do in this case is connect that to the numeric filter, and then our alpha production will change the overall look of everything and lighten it. Let's go ahead and change that color map back just to the black and white. And we could invert the alpha in the filter, which would invert the entire output. And then you could change the overall scale if needed and get a lot of different variations from that. If the black is too dark and you have a low gain set, you can just increase that darkness of that black to more of a gray. And if you want to add maybe a little bit of a blue color to enhance the ambient lighting, you can do that just by changing that color, giving a little bit of a tint. But this is just a really neat way to vary the light within a scene just directly on the sunlight. It's pretty neat. Now, if you want to have relighting on and have a nice mix between what has a light gel and what doesn't, a cool thing you can do is first what I'm going to do is just edit this gel and go back and make that color a little bit darker. So we have some darker shadows showing up, and I'm going to add another light to the scene over on the left, add a directional light, which is basically a sunlight, and we're going to match this up to the sunlight. First thing I'm going to do is turn off the point at camera option on both of these, go to the new directional light and open up or edit the object graph. And in order to match this, all we really need to do is set the orientation to be the same. So we're going to choose for our dependency of the input node to be the sunlight orientation, and then we can connect our output orientation to the input of the sunlight, so now they'll be matched and identical. We'll go ahead and take a look. I'll render that out. And now we have two light sliders. If we wanted to remove one of the lights, we can, and we can have the ability to adjust the one with the gel, and then our just straight directional light, which would be just a normal sun. It does look like the shadows are showing incorrectly, or just the overall lighting balance is different. The reason for that is if we go to the atmosphere editor, we do need to turn on apply settings to all lights, and that way the balance between ambient and sunlight and these other adjustments will apply to that directional light within the scene, and we should see it balance out a little bit better. And it does look like maybe the orientation isn't set correctly on the other light, or it just doesn't really seem to be lighting the atmosphere as much as the sunlight does. And it might just be a restriction on the other lights. Just going to go to that directional light graph and make sure everything is set up correctly. Maybe we'll go ahead and add another external dependency. So right click, add input node external dependency, and set this to the sunlight's position, and just set our position on this to be the same. And now it looks like it's appearing working correctly. Either that or it's just that relighting isn't really working entirely correctly. And it looks like just by turning or looking at the scene, if we turn off the sunlight and just look at the directional light, it acts as the sunlight. But when relighting is enabled, it doesn't really work the same way. But we can still adjust a balance between having a sunlight and the other directional light, which is set to the same orientation. And it's just another way you can adjust whether or not you want to have a light gel on and modify those shadows. It's also a neat way to mix between ray trace shadows and soft shadows. So if we were to edit this directional light, edit the object, go to shadows, and we could turn on shadow map, set the auto size, and then we have a shadow map shadows on one, and we could have the ray trace shadows on another, and you can mix in between those. Some pretty neat things you can do. And once that graph is set up and you have the identical lighting, it makes it a complete match for the position and the lighting, and just gives you an easier way to mix between different shadow modes and things like that. So overall, it's pretty neat and very powerful features when used correctly. And if you want to load it in this scene, it's called infinite grass underscore and sun gel. So if you want to take a look at this scene, if they're having any issues, maybe creating kind of the same thing, because of the randomization of certain fractals, sometimes it's hard to get an exact match. But you can go ahead and load that in, and then play around with it, dissect it, reverse engineer, and modify presets if needed.